Okay, Jake and Ella, you ready for your question? You ready?
Indeed.
Okay, here we go. What's the relationship between whether a state spent more or less than $10,000 per pupil and whether a state had an increase or decrease in spending?
Well, to answer this question, we're going to use our handy contingency table that's here. And because the question's asking us to split two numerical variables into categorical variables, what I'm going to do first is mark the lines on which these variables will be defined. So because we're looking at states that increased and decreased, the line that splits that would be at 0%. And likewise, we're looking at states with less than $10,000 per pupil spending and more than $10,000 per pupil spending. So I'll also draw a vertical line here. So this will give us four quadrants that will actually very nicely correspond with our contingency table here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make counts for how many of the boxes have how many states. So positive increases in spending and less than $10,000 per pupil spending were only 2 states, so I'll mark that with 2. And likewise, filling in the rest here, that would be 11, 22, and 16. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make the row totals and column totals, so just adding these two numbers up. The total number of states that had increases in spending was 13 and decreases was 38. And if you're wondering why it doesn't add up to 50, the District of Columbia is included in these calculations. And likewise for this, states that spent less than $10,000 per student are 24 states. And states that spent more, 27 states. And next, we can calculate what percent of the total states for columns, for this column and this row. So what percent of all the states with increases, like what percent of the total does that represent? So that would be 13 divided by 51, so that's 25%. And 38 divided by 51 is 75%. And likewise for the rows. States that spent less than $10,000 per student, 24 divided by 51, 47%. And 53%. So our next number, and I'm going to use different colors so it makes a little more visual sense, is going to be what percent did each box here count of the total number of states. So that would be 2 divided by 51 for this box, which would be 4%. And likewise 11 divided by 51 would be 22%. And just continuing to do the same thing. This would be 43%. And this would be 31%. And you'll notice that all of these percentage of the total number of observations adds up. 4 plus 22 plus 43 plus 31 would add up to 100%. So that's our total percent calculation. And then the next calculation we'll make is the column percent. So we're going to do, this time we're only going to be looking at one column at a time. So for example, the states that spent less than $10,000 per student, 2 of them had an increase in spending, and 22 of them had decreases in spending. So what we'll do here is we'll do 2 divided by 24. So 8% of states that spent less than $10,000 per student had an increase of spending. So likewise, 92% of states that spent less than $10,000 per student had a decrease in spending. Those add up to 100, and we'll do the same thing for states that spent more than $10,000 per student. 41% had an increase in spending, and 59% had a decrease in spending. And our last calculation we're going to do is our row percent. So just as we did with the columns, now we're going to look at across the rows, what percent of the increases and decreases were distributed amongst more than or less than $10,000 per student. So 2 divided by 13 is 15%. So of states that had increases in spending, 15% were from states that had spent less than $10,000 per student, and 85% were from states that spent more than $10,000 per student. And the same will apply here at the bottom. 22 divided by 38 is 58%. And 16 divided by 38 is 42%. So, of states that had decreases in spending, 22 or 58% of them were from states that spent less than $10,000 per student, and 42% were from states that spent more than $10,000 per student. And that is the full contingency table.
Terrific job, Jake. Ella, can you turn that into a mosaic plot for us?
I sure can. All right, so we can actually take this contingency table that Jake made right here and turn it into a graphic called a mosaic plot. So if we look at this side right here, this is called a marginal. So it's going to represent the proportion of states that had an increase in spending and a decrease in spending. So if we look here, 25% of the states had an increase and 75% of states had a decrease. So if we go ahead and mark off the line, so that would be 25% increase and 75% had a decrease in spending. So if we move over here, this is divided into 2 categories, less than $10,000 and greater than $10,000 spent. So we can look down here, and that tells us that 47% of states spent less than $10,000 and 53% of states spent greater than $10,000. And these widths right here represent 53% and 47%. So we can go ahead and fill that in. All right, so we're going to take a look at the less than $10,000, the percent increase and decrease. So if we look here, 8% of states that spent less than $10,000 increased. So we're going to draw a line, and this is about 8%. And 92% of states that spent less than $10,000 decreased their spending. So 92%. And then if we move over here to the greater than $10,000 spending, we see that 41% of states that spent greater than $10,000 increased their spending, and likewise 59% decreased their spending. So we have 59% decreased and 41% increased their spending. And there we have a mosaic plot.
So let me see if I've got it, Ella. Of the states that spent less than $10,000, 92% saw a decrease, or of those who spent greater than $10,000, only 59% saw a decrease.
Yep, that's it. The states that spent less than $10,000, 92% decreased their spending, and of states that spent more than $10,000, 59% decreased their spending.
Great job. Thanks for helping us out.
No problem.